Judge Arvind Mehra was a man of great respect in the city. For many years, he had worked in the courts of Delhi, deciding cases fairly and without bias. People who came to his courtroom knew that justice would be done. Arvind was famous for being calm and serious, never showing his emotions during trials. He believed that a judge's job was to follow the law strictly, no matter what feelings or personal thoughts might come to the surface. Every day he wore his black robe with pride, and he carried out his duties with a strong sense of responsibility. One early morning, Arvind was getting ready to hear a case that looked like any other. The case was about a robbery that had happened in a small shop not far from the court. The police had arrested a man they said was involved in the crime. The charges seemed clear, and the case was expected to be quick. Arvind had read the files carefully, but nothing seemed unusual at first glance. He prepared himself to listen to the lawyers, the witnesses, and then give his judgment. This was part of his routine work, and he had done this many times before. But then, when the accused man was brought into the courtroom, Arvind felt something strange. His heart skipped a beat. The man standing there was not a stranger. It was someone he hadn't seen for a very long time. Someone from his childhood. The man's name was Samir Qureshi, his childhood best friend. The years had changed them both. Samir looked tired and worn out, different from the boy Arvind remembered. But there was no doubt in Arvind's mind. It was the same Samir with whom he had spent countless afternoons playing cricket in the narrow streets of Old Delhi, sharing secrets and dreaming of their futures. Arvind's mind suddenly filled with memories from those old days. He remembered the small dusty lanes where they lived, the sound of the bustling market, and the smell of street food. Samir had been full of life and laughter back then. They had been like brothers. They did everything together, studying, playing, and helping each other. But life had taken different paths for them after school. Arvind's family had worked hard to send him to a good college, and he had eventually become a judge. Samir, however, had disappeared from his life, and Arvind had not heard from him in over 30 years. Despite his surprise, Arvind kept his calm and did not show any sign of recognition in the courtroom. A judge must be fair and should not let personal feelings affect his work. The courtroom was full of people, and everyone was waiting for the trial to begin. Arvind knew he had to focus on the facts and evidence, not on his memories. But inside, his heart was heavy with questions. How had Samir ended up accused of robbery? What had happened in all these years? Was the man before him really guilty? As the trial started, Arvind listened carefully to the statements from the police and witnesses. The case was about a robbery at a small grocery store where some money and goods were stolen. The police said they caught Samir near the scene, and they believed he was one of the robbers. But some things didn't add up for Arvind. The witnesses' stories were not very clear. Some said they saw Samir there, others said they weren't sure. Arvind found himself thinking about the boy he once knew, the friend who had a kind heart and always stood up for others. The courtroom was a place where truth and lies mixed, where every word mattered. Arvind watched Samir carefully during the hearing. Samir looked nervous, but not angry or guilty. He spoke quietly when his lawyer asked questions, and sometimes his eyes looked away from the crowd. There was something in his face that told Arvind this was more than just a criminal. This was a man broken by life's struggles. As the day went on, Arvind could not help but remember the past. He thought about their childhood, how they used to run around in the rain, how Samir helped him when he fell and hurt his knee. Samir's family was not rich. His father had died when Samir was young, and his mother had worked hard to keep the family together. Arvind's family had been better off, but they had still been close. The two boys had dreamed of making their lives better, of doing something important, but now they were meeting again under such difficult circumstances. Arvind realized that the trial was not just about law anymore. It was about two lives that had grown apart, but were still connected by a bond neither time nor distance could erase. He felt a strange mix of sadness and hope. Sadness for the lost years and the pain Samir must have faced. Hope that maybe, through the justice system, something good could still happen. The courtroom drama continued, but Arvind's mind was filled with questions he couldn't answer yet. What would the evidence show? Was Samir really guilty? Or was he a victim of bad luck and harsh circumstances? Arvind knew one thing clearly. He had to be fair, no matter what his heart told him. He had to be the judge who followed the law, but also the man who remembered a friend from a simpler time. That day, the trial was only beginning. But for Arvind, it was a moment that would change his life forever. The courtroom was not just a place for justice. It was now a place where two childhood friends would confront their past and face an uncertain future together. After that first day in the courtroom, Judge Arvind Mehra found himself thinking about Samir more than he had expected. The images of his childhood friend standing there, accused of a crime, kept coming back to him again and again. How could the boy he once knew, full of life and kindness, end up on trial for robbery? Arvind's mind was filled with questions, and the more he thought about it, the more he wanted to know what had really happened to Samir over the years. As the trial continued, Arvind started paying close attention to the details of Samir's life that came out during the proceedings. It wasn't just about the robbery anymore. It became a story of two very different lives that had taken separate paths after their childhood. Arvind was a successful judge, respected by many, while Samir's life seemed to have been full of hardship and struggle. Arvind learned that after they lost touch, Samir had faced many difficulties. His father had passed away when Samir was still a young boy, leaving his mother to care for the family alone. She worked hard, but money was always tight. Samir had to leave school early to help support his family. He took small jobs here and there, sometimes working as a mechanic in a garage, sometimes driving an auto rickshaw to earn a little money. But none of these jobs paid well, and life was never easy for him. The court heard that Samir had tried to start a small business, once a repair shop for bicycles and motorbikes. At first it looked like it might work. He was honest and hard-working, and many in the neighborhood supported him. But the business partner he trusted betrayed him. Instead of helping, the partner took loans in Samir's name and disappeared, leaving Samir with debts he could not repay. The pressure mounted, and soon Samir was in trouble with loan sharks, people who lend money but expect quick repayment with high interest, often using threats or violence. The police said that Samir had been involved in the robbery to pay off these debts, but some things didn't make sense to Arvind. During the trial, different witnesses gave different accounts. One neighbor said he saw Samir near the shop where the robbery took place. Another witness said Samir had been there but only because he wanted to stop the robbers. Some people testified that Samir was well known in the area as a good man who helped others, while others claimed he was desperate and might have done anything to survive. Arvind remembered the boy who once loved animals and cared for his friends. He wondered if the man in front of him was truly guilty, or if he had been forced into a situation he couldn't escape. The courtroom was filled with tension. Samir's lawyer tried to explain the difficult circumstances that had pushed Samir into this situation. He argued that Samir had made mistakes, but was not a criminal by nature. Meanwhile, Arvind thought about his own life and how different things could have been. He recalled the dreams they shared as children, dreams of becoming someone important and helping their families. But while Arvind had been able to study and rise in his career, Samir had been trapped in a cycle of poverty and bad luck. The judge also learned from the police records and statements that Samir had a family of his own now, a wife and 2 children. His wife worked as a domestic helper, and they struggled to make ends meet. Samir's hopes for a better life had been slowly crushed by one bad event after another. It was clear that Samir was not someone who wanted to break the law, but rather someone who had made one terrible mistake when life had no other options. As the trial went on, Arvind felt a deep sadness for his old friend. He thought about the choices people make when they are desperate, and how sometimes society does not give a second chance to those who fall. He wanted to find out the truth, to understand what had really happened on the day of the robbery. At the same time, Arvind remained professional. He reminded himself that he was a judge, not a friend. His job was to look at the evidence and decide what the law said. But inside, he struggled to separate his feelings from his duty. The people in the courtroom started to notice something different about this case. It was not just a crime story anymore. It was a human story, full of struggle, loss, and hope. Some witnesses came forward to speak kindly about Samir, telling stories of how he had helped neighbors, how he had once returned a lost wallet full of money, and how he was always honest despite his difficulties. Arvind was touched by these stories. They made him think that maybe there was more to Samir's character than the prosecution wanted everyone to believe. He began to see his childhood friend not just as the accused, but as a man who had been beaten down by life, but still had goodness left inside. The trial revealed how life can take people down different paths, and how sometimes those paths cross, again in the most unexpected ways. Arvind realized that his role was not just to judge a crime, but to look deeper, to try to understand the circumstances that shaped Samir's life. The days passed slowly, and the trial became a turning point in both their lives. For Arvind, it was a reminder of the power of friendship and memory. For Samir, it was a chance to tell his side of the story, to show that he was not a criminal, but a man who had made mistakes and deserved a second chance. Arvind's heart was heavy, but he knew he had to wait for the evidence, for the witnesses, and for the truth to come out in the courtroom. The judge was ready to listen carefully and keep an open mind, hoping that justice would be fair and that the truth, whatever it was, would finally be revealed. Days passed after the trial's first hearings, but Judge Arvind Mehra's mind remained restless. The courtroom had become more than just a place where justice was served. It had turned into a place where memories, emotions, and long-forgotten bonds clashed with the cold facts of the law. Every moment Arvind was reminded of Samir Qureshi, his childhood friend who now stood accused in front of him. It was difficult for Arvind to focus entirely on the case, but he was determined to be fair and just. Yet beneath his calm exterior, an intense storm brewed. One afternoon, during a short break in the court proceedings, Arvind was surprised when a small note was quietly handed to him by a court peon. The note was folded neatly, and Arvind recognized the handwriting instantly. It was from Samir. The message was simple but filled with pain. It read, "I'm sorry. Life broke me." Arvind held the note in his hands, feeling a mix of emotions, sorrow, guilt, and a deep longing to understand his old friend's life story better. How much had Samir suffered in all these years? How did a boy who once dreamed with him of a better future end up in such despair? The note was a silent cry, a plea for compassion, but also a reminder of how far apart their lives had drifted. That night, Arvind found it hard to sleep. The note kept coming back to his thoughts. In his quiet study room, he opened an old wooden cupboard and pulled out a dusty box. Inside he found an old photo album filled with black and white pictures of childhood days, days filled with laughter, innocence, and hope. He found a faded photograph of himself and Samir, taken when they were about 10 years old. In the picture, both boys were smiling, their arms around each other's shoulders, standing in front of a small cricket field in their neighborhood. Looking at that photograph, Arvind felt a rush of emotions. He remembered Samir's bright eyes, his mischievous smile, and how kind he was to everyone. Samir was the boy who never hesitated to share his lunch with hungry friends. The boy who had taken care of stray animals, feeding them whenever he could. They had once promised each other that no matter where life took them, they would always stay true to themselves. Now, that promise seemed like a distant dream. The next day, Arvind decided he needed to learn more about Samir's life beyond the courtroom. He wanted to understand the man behind the accusations. He knew he had to be careful, not to interfere with the case, but to see if the story he remembered as a child was still true in some way. During a break, Arvind visited the neighborhood where they had grown up. Old Delhi's crowded streets, filled with small shops, loud markets, and narrow alleys. The neighborhood had changed a little, but its heart was still the same. He walked down the familiar lanes, feeling the weight of time pressing on his shoulders. People recognized him and greeted him warmly, but what Arvind really wanted was to find someone who remembered Samir, the real Samir, not just the man accused in the trial. He visited a few old shopkeepers and neighbors. Some remembered Samir well. One elderly man, who ran a small tea stall near their old cricket ground, smiled when Arvind mentioned Samir's name. "Ah, Samir," he said. "A good boy, always honest. I remember him from when he was young. He never wanted trouble. Life was tough for him, but he was good-hearted." Arvind listened carefully as the man told stories of how Samir had helped the neighborhood in small ways, fixing broken bicycles for free, giving food to children who were hungry, and standing up against bullies. The stories painted a picture, quite different from the one being presented in the courtroom. He then visited the home where Samir had lived as a child. The small, cramped house still stood, its walls worn but filled with memories. A few neighbors spoke about Samir's mother, a brave woman who had raised her children alone after the father passed away. They said she had done everything possible to keep the family together, working day and night. But poverty was relentless. Arvind also met a former employer of Samir's, a man who had run a small bicycle repair shop. The employer said that Samir was one of the most honest workers he had ever met. One day, the employer told Arvind Samir had found a lost wallet containing 20,000 rupees and returned it to the owner without keeping a single rupee. Such honesty was rare, he said. All these stories gave Arvind hope, but also confusion. How could the man who had done so much good be accused of robbery? Was it possible that Samir had been misunderstood or wrongly accused? Arvind knew he couldn't let his feelings cloud his judgment, but he also knew that justice was not only about punishment, it was about truth. Back in the courtroom, as the trial continued, new evidence came to light. Some witnesses who had earlier testified against Samir began to change their statements. One young man said that he had seen Samir trying to stop the robbery, not join it. Another witness said that Samir had been at the scene to help the shop owner, who was injured during the crime. Arvind watched carefully as these new testimonies were presented. Each one chipped away at the prosecution's case. The lawyer for the defense argued strongly that Samir had been at the wrong place at the wrong time. He said that Samir was not a criminal, but a victim of circumstance. But the prosecution was not ready to give up. They insisted that Samir had been involved, and that his desperate situation was no excuse. The trial became a battle between two stories, one of a man fighting for survival, and one of a man accused of a crime. Arvind felt the weight of his responsibility more than ever. He had to listen carefully, question thoroughly, and remember everything he knew about both the law and the man standing in front of him. One evening, after the court had adjourned, Arvind sat in his chambers, thinking about what he had learned. He realized that Samir's life was like a mirror reflecting the harsh realities of many people living in the city. People who worked hard but were trapped in poverty. People who made mistakes because they had no other choice. People who deserved justice but also compassion. Arvind also knew that the truth was still hidden somewhere, between the statements, the evidence, and the silence of those who feared to speak. He thought about reaching out to Samir, not as a judge but as a friend, but he stopped himself. The courtroom was no place for personal feelings. He had to wait for the right time, the right moment. At the same time, Arvind wondered what Samir must be feeling. The fear, the shame, the loneliness. He imagined how hard it must be for a man to stand accused in front of the person who once called him brother. The trial went on, and with each passing day, the story of Samir became clearer, but also more complex. It was a story of struggle, pain, and hope, a story that went beyond the crime and punishment. Arvind felt that this trial was not just about the law. It was about two friends meeting again after decades, trying to find a way through the darkness. He promised himself that, no matter what the verdict would be, he would remember the boy who once shared his dreams, and the man who still fought for a chance to live a better life. The trial had reached its fourth phase, and the courtroom atmosphere had changed. It was no longer just about facts and evidence. It had become a story of two very different lives intersecting in ways neither Arvind nor Samir could have predicted. As the days passed, Judge Arvind Mehra found himself struggling harder to separate his emotions from his duties. Every time Samir stood before him, he saw not just the accused, but the boy he once called his closest friend. One morning, as the court resumed, a new witness was called. This witness was unexpected and important, a person who could bring clarity to the case. It was an old school teacher named Mrs. Khan, who had taught both Arvind and Samir many years ago. She was now retired but still remembered her students well. Mrs. Khan entered the courtroom with a calm and gentle presence. She spoke softly but with confidence, explaining how she had known both boys during their school days. She said that both Arvind and Samir were bright students, but their lives had taken very different paths. She told the court stories of Samir's kindness, his eagerness to learn, and how he had always been respectful even in the hardest times. What surprised everyone was when Mrs. Khan revealed something she had kept quiet for years. She said that during the time Samir was in school, there was a rumor about a group of boys who sometimes got into trouble. Samir had tried to stay away from them, but he had also been pressured by circumstances. Sometimes young boys from poor families got pushed into bad company, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. Mrs. Khan's testimony was powerful because it showed the court that Samir's life had been complicated by forces beyond his control. She said she had seen how hard Samir's mother had worked to keep him away from trouble, but sometimes the world was too harsh. After Mrs. Khan finished, Arvind felt a deep sadness. He knew the world outside the courtroom was full of challenges that the law didn't always understand. It was not just about guilt or innocence. It was about understanding why people do what they do. The defense lawyer used Mrs. Khan's testimony to argue that Samir had never been a criminal at heart. Instead, he was a victim of circumstances, a man who had tried his best but had been let down by life. He asked the court to consider Samir's background and the hardships he had faced before passing any judgment. The prosecutor, however, stood firm. He said that no matter what happened in the past, the law must be followed. Crimes had been committed, and the accused had to be held responsible. His words were harsh but echoed the rules of the justice system. In the courtroom, Arvind listened carefully to both sides. He was torn. As a judge, he had to be fair and impartial, but as a human being, he felt the pain of a childhood friend crushed by life's difficulties. That evening, Arvind sat in his chambers, thinking deeply. He opened the old photo album again and looked at pictures of their school days, laughing children, bright eyes full of hope. He remembered the promises they had made to each other, promises to always do the right thing and help those in need. He wondered if Samir still held on to those promises or if the hardships had broken his spirit. Arvind felt a strong urge to find out more about Samir's family, his wife and children. He wanted to see if there was a way to help beyond the courtroom. The next day, Arvind took a small but brave step. During the lunch break, he asked a court official to arrange a meeting with Samir's wife, Aisha. Arvind knew this was unusual, but he believed that understanding Samir's family situation was important for the trial and for justice. When Aisha arrived, she was nervous but polite. She wore simple clothes and had tired eyes that spoke of long nights and hard work. She told Arvind about their life together, the struggles to pay bills, the fear of losing their home, and the hope they still held for a better future. She said, Samir was a good man who had made mistakes, but loved his family deeply. Hearing her story, Arvind's heart softened. He saw the human cost of the trial, not just for Samir, but for the entire family. He knew that whatever the court decided, the consequences would reach far beyond the courtroom walls. As the trial went on, more evidence was brought forward. Some of it was technical, like CCTV footage from nearby shops and phone records. The footage showed the robbery happening, but it was unclear whether Samir was involved. Phone records placed him near the scene, but again, they didn't prove guilt beyond doubt. During cross-examination, Arvind noticed something important. Samir's lawyer was asking questions that revealed a bigger picture. They pointed out that the real robbers were still not caught, and some evidence suggested that others were involved. The defense argued that Samir might have been at the wrong place at the wrong time, or even trying to stop the robbery. The courtroom grew tense. Everyone waited for the next piece of evidence, the next witness, the next truth to emerge. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, Arvind continued his quiet investigation. He visited local community centers and spoke to people who knew Samir. Some spoke highly of him, praising his efforts to support his family despite everything. Others were less sure, afraid to get involved. Arvind learned that Samir had recently been trying to get back on his feet. He had joined a community group that helped people find jobs and learn new skills. It was a small but important step, showing that Samir wanted to change his life for the better. The judge thought about this deeply. Could justice mean giving Samir a chance to rebuild rather than simply punishing him? Could the court balance punishment with mercy? Back inside the courtroom, the trial entered its final stages. Arvind prepared himself to make a decision that would not just affect Samir, but also touch the hearts of everyone who had watched this story unfold. On the day of the final hearing, the courtroom was packed. Media reporters, lawyers, neighbors, and even some of Arvind's old school friends had come to see the conclusion of the case. As Arvind took his seat on the bench, he looked at Samir. The man had changed little, still nervous but with a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Arvind knew that whatever happened next would shape not only Samir's future, but also his own understanding of justice and friendship. The lawyers presented their closing arguments. The prosecution asked for a harsh sentence, insisting that the law must be upheld. The defense pleaded for mercy, asking the court to consider the full story of Samir's life and the mistakes he had made. Arvind listened carefully, weighing every word. His mind was filled with memories, stories, evidence, and the faces of those who had testified. Finally, it was time for Arvind to speak. He stood up and looked around the courtroom. His voice was steady but full of emotion as he began to explain his decision. He spoke about the importance of justice, but also about understanding the human behind the crime. He acknowledged Samir's difficult past, his struggles, and his efforts to change. He reminded everyone that the law was not just about punishment, but also about fairness and hope. Arvind decided that Samir should not be punished harshly, but given a chance to rebuild his life. He ordered that Samir be placed under probation and required to participate in community service and counseling programs. The courtroom was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, a wave of relief and hope spread through the room. Samir looked at Arvind with tears in his eyes. For the first time in a long while, he felt seen and understood, not just as an accused man, but as a person. After the trial, Arvind and Samir met briefly in private. They shared a quiet moment, remembering their childhood and looking forward to a future that was uncertain but filled with possibility. This case had changed both their lives. Arvind had learned that justice was more than laws and rules. It was about compassion, understanding, and the courage to see the whole story. Samir had been given a second chance, a chance to rise above his past and rebuild his life. The story of the judge and his childhood friend became a powerful lesson for everyone who heard it. A story of friendship, justice, and hope, that even in the darkest moments, there is light. The day finally came when the trial was over. The courtroom, which had been a place of tension, emotions, and difficult decisions, now felt quiet, almost peaceful. Judge Arvind Mehra sat on the bench, his heart heavy but calm. He had made his decision, but the story of him and Samir was far from over. This last part was about what happened after the court's verdict, how two old friends faced the future, and the changes their lives would undergo. Samir walked out of the courtroom, no longer a prisoner behind bars, but a man under probation. It wasn't freedom in the fullest sense, but it was a chance, a new beginning. His heart was full of mixed feelings: relief, fear, hope, and determination. The weight of the past years still hung on his shoulders, but now there was a faint light guiding him forward. As Samir stepped outside, he was greeted by his wife Aisha and their two children. Their faces were filled with tears of joy and relief. The community, which had watched the trial closely, started to rally around Samir's family. People who once doubted him began to offer support. Old neighbors, school friends, and even strangers reached out, offering jobs, encouragement, and friendship. Arvind watched this quietly from a distance. The judge had done what he believed was right, but seeing Samir reunited with his family stirred something deep inside him. He remembered the boy who used to run barefoot in the dusty streets, full of dreams and laughter. He hoped that Samir could find that boy inside himself again. The first weeks after the verdict were not easy. Samir had to attend regular meetings with a probation officer, complete community service, and join counseling sessions to address his past and plan a better future. These sessions were difficult, forcing him to confront his mistakes and fears. But Samir was determined. He wanted to rebuild his life, not just for himself, but for his family. Aisha stood by him every step of the way. She was his pillar of strength, reminding him of their dreams and the children who needed a father who could provide and protect. Their children, young and full of innocent hope, inspired Samir to keep moving forward. In the community center, Samir started volunteering, helping others who faced struggles like his own. He shared his story, not to gain sympathy, but to inspire change. Slowly, people began to see him not as a criminal, but as a man who had made mistakes, but was working hard to correct them. Meanwhile, Arvind continued his work as a judge, but his view of justice had shifted. He often thought about the lessons he had learned from this case, that the law was important, but so was understanding the human behind every story. He became more involved in community outreach programs, trying to bridge the gap between law and society, justice and mercy. One day, Arvind received an invitation from Samir. It was a simple card, handwritten, inviting him and his family to a small gathering at the community center. Samir wanted to thank him in person for the chance to change his life. At the gathering, Arvind saw a different Samir, stronger, more confident, and full of hope. The community had come together to celebrate progress, second chances, and the power of friendship. Arvind felt proud but also humbled by the transformation he witnessed. Over the months, Samir found a steady job through the support of the community. He repaired bicycles, helped with small repairs around the neighborhood, and slowly earned enough to support his family. The children began to do better in school, inspired by their father's determination. The friendship between Arvind and Samir grew stronger too. They met often, sharing stories of their lives, their dreams, and their struggles. They found comfort in their bond, proving that even the hardest trials couldn't break true friendship. This story, which began with a shocking courtroom moment, had turned into a powerful lesson for everyone involved. It showed that people are more than their mistakes, that justice is not only about punishment, but also about giving chances, and that friendship can survive even the toughest tests. Arvind and Samir's journey became an example in their city. Local newspapers wrote about it, and community leaders talked about it as a symbol of hope and change. Their story inspired many who felt trapped by their circumstances, reminding them that it is never too late to start over. Years later, when people looked back at the case, they saw more than a trial. They saw a story of compassion, courage, and transformation. Samir had become a mentor for youth in the neighborhood, helping them avoid the mistakes he had made. Arvind continued to serve as a judge, but with a deeper understanding of justice that combined law and humanity. This story did not end with a verdict. It ended with new beginnings.